There's a specific kind of quiet that happens right after you find out someone forged your father's signature. Not shock, exactly. Something slower than that. A kind of settling, cold and heavy, right in the center of your chest, while you sit there staring at a piece of paper that's supposed to prove your parents' entire estate belongs to someone else now. Stories like this one only really land for the people who stay until the very end. So if that sounds like you, go ahead and subscribe now and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I need to know I'm not the only one who's ever sat frozen in a moment exactly like this one. Both of my parents died within 8 months of each other last year. My mother, Louise, from stage 4 cancer that moved faster than any of the doctors expected. My father, Harold, from advanced dementia that had been stealing pieces of him for years before it finally took the rest. I want to be honest with you about something before I go any further into this story, because it matters for everything that comes after it. During the last 2 years of their lives, while both of them were declining at the same time in the same house, my older sister Vanessa took over almost everything related to their care. And at the time, none of us questioned it. She lived closer. She had more flexibility with her job. It made sense, on paper, for her to be the one handling the day-to-day logistics while I stayed in close contact from 3 hours away, working full-time and raising 2 kids of my own. What I didn't understand yet, not for a long time, was how completely that arrangement would end up shutting me out of everything. Growing up, Vanessa and I shared a room until I was 11 years old, 2 twin beds pushed against opposite walls with a strip of masking tape down the middle of the carpet that neither of us was allowed to cross without permission. She was 4 years older, which meant she spent most of my childhood either bossing me around or fiercely protecting me from anyone else who tried, sometimes within the same afternoon. She taught me how to ride a bike in the church parking lot down the street. She walked me to the bus stop every single morning through elementary school, holding my hand the whole way, even after I told her repeatedly that I was too old for that. We drifted, the way siblings sometimes do once we both had our own households, our own kids, our own lives filling up the space where daily closeness used to be. But there was still a foundation there, decades deep, that made it almost impossible for me to imagine her capable of the thing I eventually found sitting at that kitchen table. Vanessa told the rest of the family early on that she had been granted power of attorney for both of our parents, allowing her to make financial and medical decisions on their behalf once they were no longer able to make those decisions clearly themselves. She also mentioned, almost in passing during one phone call, something called a ladybird deed, a type of deed that in some states lets a homeowner transfer property automatically to a chosen person after death without the property having to go through probate court at all. I didn't know what either of those terms fully meant back then. I trusted her. She was my sister. Our parents trusted her enough to name her, so I assumed I should too. But she never once showed me either document, not the power of attorney paperwork, not the deed, not anything with an actual signature or a notary stamp on it. Every time I asked, gently at first and then less gently as the months went on, she had a reason ready. I don't have it on me right now. It's with the lawyer. I'll email it to you when things calm down a little. Things never calmed down enough, apparently, for that email to ever actually arrive. She also began controlling who got to visit our parents and when. I'd drive the 3 hours out on a Saturday, only to be told our father was too tired for visitors that day, or that our mother had a doctor's appointment that ran long and needed rest afterward. I remember one specific Saturday, maybe 5 months before our mother passed, driving out with a bag of her favorite peaches from a farm stand near my house, only to sit in Vanessa's driveway for 20 minutes while she explained through the car window that Mom had had a rough night and really shouldn't be disturbed. I left the peaches on the porch and drove 3 hours home without ever seeing my mother that day. I found out weeks later from a home health aide who mentioned it in passing that our mother had specifically asked about me that same afternoon, wondering out loud why I hadn't visited in a while. Sometimes those explanations Vanessa gave were probably true. Our parents were genuinely sick, genuinely fragile, genuinely needing quiet and rest more often than not. But looking back at the pattern of it now, spread out across nearly 2 years, it started to look less like protecting them and more like something else entirely. Every major medical decision went through Vanessa first. Every financial account, every bill, every insurance conversation funneled through her, with the rest of us receiving only brief updates whenever she decided we needed one. I told myself over and over during those 2 years that I was overreacting, that grief and stress were making me paranoid about my own sister, a woman I'd grown up sharing a room with, a woman who used to walk me to the bus stop every single morning when I was too small and scared to go alone. I didn't want to be the difficult sibling. I didn't want to cause friction while our parents were still alive and struggling enough as it was. So I stayed quiet, mostly, and let her handle things the way she said needed to be handled. Our mother passed first in early spring. Our father followed 8 months later in early winter, his mind having drifted somewhere else entirely for the final stretch of his life, somewhere none of us could reach him anymore, not even Vanessa. In the numb weeks right after his funeral, going through paperwork the way you have to when a parent dies, I finally asked Vanessa directly, in writing this time, over email, for a copy of the Ladybird deed she'd mentioned so many times over the past 2 years. It took her almost 3 weeks to send it. When it finally arrived, I sat at my kitchen table and read it slowly, twice, my coffee going cold beside me. The deed transferred the house, along with everything inside it, directly to Vanessa upon our father's death, bypassing probate entirely, exactly the way she'd described it to us months earlier. My father's signature sat at the bottom of the page, along with a notary stamp certifying that he had personally appeared and signed the document, of sound mind, in front of the witness. Something about the signature stopped me cold before I'd even fully processed what I was looking at. I'd seen my father's signature my entire life, on birthday cards, on school permission slips, on the back of countless photographs he'd labeled over the decades in his small, careful handwriting. This didn't look quite right. The angle was slightly off. The pressure was too even, too controlled, missing the small, natural tremor that had crept into his handwriting over his last several years of declining health. My father's hands had shaken noticeably for the final 3 years of his life, a symptom his neurologist had documented repeatedly in his medical file. This signature showed no trace of that tremor at all. It was smooth, almost too smooth, like someone who'd practiced it a few times beforehand. I pulled up every old document I could find with his actual signature on it. Tax forms going back a decade, old greeting cards I'd kept in a shoebox in my closet, the kind you save without ever really deciding to. A signed baseball card from a hobby he'd had years earlier that I'd kept in a drawer for no particular reason other than it felt wrong to throw away. A hospital consent form from just 8 months before he died, his signature on that one visibly shaky, slanting downward toward the end of his name the way it always did by then. I lined every single one of them up next to a printed copy of the deed and stared at all of them together on my kitchen table for what felt like an hour, my coffee going untouched and eventually cold beside my elbow. I contacted an attorney the following week, a woman named Miss Delgado, who specialized in probate and estate disputes, and brought everything I had with me to that first meeting, an entire manila folder thick with printed comparisons and sticky notes I'd added at 2 in the morning when I couldn't sleep. Her office was small, tucked into a strip mall between a dry cleaner and a dentist's office. Nothing fancy about it, but she had a way of looking carefully at every single page I handed her instead of rushing through them the way I half expected a busy attorney to do. She looked over the deed carefully, then looked over the comparison signatures I'd gathered, laying them all out side by side across her desk, and got quiet in a way that told me everything before she even said a word out loud. She picked up the hospital consent form from 8 months before his death and held it next to the deed for a long moment, comparing them under her desk lamp.
"I'm not a certified forensic document examiner," she said carefully, setting both pages down, "but I've reviewed enough of these over the years to tell you that this concerns me. The letter formation is inconsistent with these other samples in several places. Notice how controlled and even this signature is, compared to every other sample you've brought me from around the same time period. I'd strongly recommend we get a professional handwriting analysis before we go any further."
I also ran the comparison myself through a couple of different online signature verification tools that same night, sitting up long after my kids had gone to bed, uploading clear images of his known signatures alongside the signature on the deed. Every single one flagged significant inconsistencies. None of them obviously carry the same legal weight as a certified forensic examiner, but every single result pointed in the exact same direction. And by that point, I no longer needed much convincing. Then came the detail that turned my stomach the most. The notary who had certified that signature, whose stamp and seal appeared right there on the document swearing that she had personally witnessed my father sign it, of sound mind in her presence, turned out to be a close personal friend of Vanessa's, a woman named Kimberly who I recognized the moment I saw her name printed under the stamp because she'd been at Vanessa's 40th birthday party 2 years earlier, sitting 3 seats down from me at the same table. I sat with that information for several days before I did anything else with it. Miss Delgado had explained to me in that first meeting that what I was looking at could potentially constitute a second-degree felony, both for whoever actually forged the signature and for anyone who knowingly participated in falsely notarizing a fraudulent document. That's not a small accusation to level at your own sister. That's not something you can quietly walk back later if you change your mind partway through. I want to be honest with you about the part of this that kept me stuck for weeks, because I think it's the part that matters most, more than the legal details, more than the deed itself. I was terrified of what the rest of my family would think of me. I could already hear the conversations happening without me in them, that I was the difficult one, that I was tearing apart what was left of our family over money, mere months after burying both of our parents. That grief had made me paranoid or greedy or both. Vanessa had spent 2 years positioning herself as the devoted daughter who'd sacrificed everything to care for our parents, while I lived my life 3 hours away. I knew exactly how this would look to extended family members who hadn't seen what I'd started piecing together. I lay awake most nights that month running through every possible version of the conversation I'd eventually have to have with someone in the family. I drafted and deleted a text message to my aunt at least 4 separate times before I finally worked up the nerve to just call her directly instead. I remember sitting in my car in my own driveway for almost 20 minutes with the phone in my lap before I actually pressed call, engine off, just staring at her name on the screen. I called my aunt, our mother's younger sister, and tried to explain what I'd found, as carefully and factually as I could manage, laying out the signature comparisons, the notary connection, everything Miss Delgado had told me. There was a long pause on her end of the line before she finally said, gently but firmly, "Are you sure you're not just upset about the house? Grief does strange things to people, sweetheart." I remember sitting there afterward, phone still in my hand, engine still off, feeling more alone in that moment than I had at either of my parents' funerals. I didn't cry until after I hung up. I didn't want her to hear it. A cousin I'd always been close with growing up sent me a message a few days later, clearly relaying something she'd heard from Vanessa's side of the family grapevine, gently suggesting maybe I should let this one go for everyone's sake. I read that message probably a dozen times over the following week, turning the phrase "for everyone's sake" over and over in my head, noticing how conveniently it seemed to leave our father's actual signature completely out of the conversation. But I kept coming back to one thought, over and over in the weeks that followed.
My father built that house with his own hands, quite literally, doing much of the original construction work himself back in his 30s. My mother filled it with 40 years of a life the two of them built together, piece by piece. The wallpaper she'd chosen in the kitchen, the garden she'd tended out back for decades. Whatever this ended up costing me socially within a family that was already fracturing in slow motion, I couldn't let a forged signature quietly become the final word on everything they'd spent their entire lives building. I moved forward. Miss Delgado helped me file a formal challenge to the deed with the court, along with a request for a certified forensic handwriting analysis, funded jointly by what savings I had and a small loan I took out specifically for this purpose. Writing that check for the forensic examiner felt strange in a way I hadn't expected, spending money I didn't really have to spare in order to prove something I already knew in my gut to be true. The forensic examiner's report came back 6 weeks later, more definitive than even Miss Delgado had expected. The signature showed clear indicators of forgery, including inconsistent pen pressure patterns and letter formations that didn't match any of the 12 genuine comparison samples we'd submitted, spanning nearly 15 years of my father's actual handwriting. I read that report sitting at the exact same kitchen table where this whole thing started, my kids doing homework in the next room, and felt something in my chest finally loosen after months of holding my breath. Miss Delgado filed everything with the court immediately, along with a formal complaint referred to the state notary regulation board regarding Kimberly's notarization. Within a month, Kimberly's notary commission was suspended pending a full investigation into the circumstances surrounding that specific signing. She has since told investigators, according to what Miss Delgado has been able to confirm through the ongoing proceedings, that she notarized the document without our father actually being present at all, at Vanessa's specific request, believing at the time it was simply a formality to speed up paperwork Vanessa said our father had already verbally agreed to. Vanessa has not spoken to me directly since I filed the challenge. Not a call, not a text, not so much as a single word, even though we live only 3 hours apart and used to talk almost every week before all of this. She's spoken to other family members plenty, from what I understand secondhand. I've heard through my aunt and through a cousin who still checks in on me occasionally that Vanessa describes me to anyone who'll listen as vindictive, as someone who waited until our parents were barely in the ground to attack her character over a house she believes she earned through 2 years of exhausting, thankless caregiving. Some of that caregiving was real. I want to be fair about that. Even now, even after everything, she did handle an enormous amount during those 2 years, more than I ever stepped up to handle myself, living 3 hours away with 2 kids of my own to raise, showing up on weekends instead of every single day the way she did. I've had to sit with that complicated truth alongside everything else, the knowledge that someone can genuinely sacrifice real time and energy for aging parents and still, separately, commit an actual crime against the rest of the family in the process. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive, as much as I wish they were, as much as it would be so much easier if she were simply, cleanly the villain of this entire story, without any complicated shading to it at all. The case is still moving through the courts as I'm telling you this. The forged deed has been formally challenged, and early indications from Miss Delgado suggest the judge is taking the forensic evidence extremely seriously. Whatever happens with the house itself, whatever happens with any potential criminal charges against Vanessa or against Kimberly, I've already made peace with the choice I made to pursue this instead of staying quiet, the way a large part of me desperately wanted to for months. I drove out to the house alone one weekend last month, before any of the legal proceedings had concluded, and sat in my car outside it for a while without going in. The garden our mother tended for decades was overgrown already, weeds pushing up through the beds she used to kneel beside every spring with her knees on an old folded towel. I thought about the two of them building that entire life together over 40 years, one paycheck and one weekend project at a time, never imagining it would end up sitting at the center of a fraud investigation involving their own daughters. I still don't know what our relationship looks like on the other side of this, assuming there even is another side to reach. I don't know if the rest of my extended family will ever stop quietly wondering whether I did the right thing, or whether grief simply broke something in me that made me turn on my own sister over property and money. But I know what actually happened to that signature. I know what I found sitting at my kitchen table with my coffee going cold beside me. And I know that if I'd stayed silent to protect how people perceived me, I would have spent the rest of my life knowing I let a forged piece of paper become the final chapter of my parents' entire life's work without ever saying a single word about it. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace in your family and telling the truth about something you couldn't unsee, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments what you would have done sitting at that kitchen table. And if this story kept you until the very last word, subscribe now because there are more stories exactly like this one coming every single week.